Alright guys, welcome back to another ASMR video. And today we're going to look into the making of Assassin's Creed, the 15th anniversary. It's interesting to say that it's the 15th. It would have been had this book came out in, or last year, I should say. It was supposed to, but it's got delayed a couple of times. But this is the special edition. It actually comes with a slip cover, as you can see here. Slip cover. I'll take it out. And it also comes with some lithographs. So we have that one. And then we have this one here. And this is Altair in Assassin's Creed 1, both of them, I believe. This is definitely Altair here. So we're going to put this protective paper back on. And we'll put that to the side. And then the actual back, Leap into History, the making of Assassin's Creed 15th anniversary. Discover the genesis of each Assassin's Creed game and get an insider's look at the efforts that went into creating one of the biggest franchises in the video game industry. This deluxe edition features a decorative slipcase, exclusive foil stamped cover treatment, a folio enclosing 2 gallery quality prints. In observance of Assassin's Creed's 15-year anniversary, Ubisoft and Dark Horse Books have teamed up for an extensive examination into the creation of the award-winning Assassin's Creed franchise, featuring gorgeous art from over a decade and a half of development and detailed interviews with the game's past and present creators. This is the perfect companion piece for any aspiring assassin. Put that there. Let's pull the book out, and here it is. And let's dive in. Let's see what there is to see here in this book. Okay. So, The Making of Assassin's Creed 15th Anniversary, written by Alex Calvin. So the table of contents, we have dedication, forward, Chapter 1, Everything is Permitted, Chapter 2, the Ezio Trilogy, Chapter 3, the Kenway Dynasty, Chapter 4, the Age of Revolution, Chapter 5, Ancient Assassination, Chapter 6, Honoring the Original, Chapter 7, Transmedia Development, and then Interviewees. And I'm going to guess that maybe this got delayed because, as we all know, Assassin's Creed Mirage comes out in 2 days, and it is sort of going back to its roots. So potentially Chapter 6 may be about Mirage, and if it is, we're going to hold off on going over it until I finish the game. So, anyway, dedication. Thank you to all the Assassin's Creed players and fans across the world. It is with your support that we have been able to continually raise the bar and challenge ourselves to create rich and innovative experiences year after year. We dedicate this book to you. Okay. Forward by Mark Alexis Cote. 15 years ago, a game revolutionized the open world genre through the introduction of technological breakthroughs that allowed a freedom of movement and an immersion that had never been seen before, coupled with an edgy narrative meta-story that promised a bright future for subsequent games. 15 years ago, then, Assassin's Creed was born through the craft of an ambitious team that had reinvented the Prince of Persia franchise a few years earlier. Driven by their passion and commitment, they were on a mission to redefine the action-adventure game for the next generation of consoles. They were so successful that today we have the honor of carrying that legacy forward. a legacy that takes many forms. First is embracing the richness of diversity. One of the things I've been most proud of while working on Assassin's Creed is how much of a beacon for diversity it has been. We launched Assassin's Creed with a hero of Arabic descent, born of a Christian mother and a Muslim father. Our greatest early success came at the hands of Ratanokin, I'm botching that by the way, but a Native American. The rebirth of Assassin's Creed in 2017, with Origins featured Bayek, an Egyptian hero. Aveline, Shao Jun, Evie, and Cassandra gradually paved the way for more gender diversity. We researched the settings, cultures, and periods of our games in a way that has made working on this franchise an eye-opening journey through the importance of creating inclusiveness in our world for all those who encounter it. Secondly, we carry with us the desire to constantly innovate and reinvent ourselves. With every game that I've had the chance to work on, I have had the privilege of being surrounded by incredibly brilliant people who wish to push our industry forward. People who are not afraid to try new things and to take risks. People for whom technological and creative limits are only a creation of the mind. Every new period we choose to feature in our games creates an incredible playground where our creators can thrive. Finally, our legacy is one of transforming history into one of the most eye-opening sources of entertainment around. One of the greatest entertainers of all time, Walt Disney, said, "I would rather entertain and hope that people learn something than educate people and hope they were entertained." By creating virtual worlds that are rich with knowledge and insights about our real world, we can leverage the power and interactivity of video games to open our collective minds to the lessons that the past can give us to create a better future. As we shape the course of the franchise over its 15 years, Assassin's Creed also changed us. As this book dives into the history of the franchise, I hope it helps you appreciate all the passion and challenges that go into creating something that is loved by millions of fans throughout the world. As you will see, we all came to Assassin's Creed differently, and let me whet your appetite with my own personal story. To say I was not destined to take over the reins of Assassin's Creed is an understatement. My relationship with Assassin's Creed started as many momentous events in life do, reluctantly and unexpectedly. On a cold winter day in January 2010, my boss intercepted me in the hallway as I was entering the office, yanked me away from my project, asked me to follow him to his car, and started the 3-hour drive from Quebec City to Montreal, where I would undertake the exciting mandate of giving life to some of the war machines imagined by Leonardo da Vinci. 12 months later, I had the honor of accepting a game award in Los Angeles for Assassin's Creed Brotherhood on behalf of our entire worldwide team. The award show was on the same day as the Montreal studio's Christmas party. My initial reservations morphed into passion with every game I worked on, as I discovered the eye-opening nature of history. Working on Assassin's Creed is a privilege that I will cherish throughout my life, as it helped me better understand how our past, present, and future are inexorably intertwined. Mark Alexis Cote, VP and Executive Producer, Assassin's Creed. So we have Chapter 1, Everything is Permitted. Assassin's Creed. It's no secret that Assassin's Creed's roots lie within the Prince of Persia franchise. Back in 2001, French publisher Ubisoft acquired the license to Jordan Mechner's classic series of 2D platformers, with the aim of bringing them into the 3D realm. The result was 2003's Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, a title that would spawn 3 sequels and almost immediately reach cult status following its release. Within months of its release, it had sold millions of copies around the world. And as of 2014, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time had sold more than 14 million copies around the world. It's unsurprising that Ubisoft wanted more from the team that created The Sands of Time. The crew was tasked with making a brand new Prince of Persia game for the upcoming generation of consoles. These new machines, Sony's PlayStation 3 and Microsoft's Xbox 360, were far more powerful than their predecessors. This meant that they could produce not just more impressive graphics, but also those of greater complexity. When interviewing to be a producer, Jade Raymond was asked by Giannis Malat, who at the time was an executive producer at Ubisoft Montreal, how she would update the Prince of Persia formula. My answer had three parts. First, I would enhance and evolve the combat system. Second, I also said that I'd create more of an open world version, where players would have more autonomy and more freedom to play how they want, she remembers. I think at the time, Grand Theft Auto had recently released, so I said imagine that openness of GTA. Third, I'd probably gear the brand toward a more mature audience. So those were the three things I suggested, and they coincided with what Giannis was hoping for, so I got the job. Killing time. It wasn't until Raymond was actually hired as a producer that she was told what she would be working on. This version of the game, dubbed Prince of Persia Assassins, is somewhere between the Sands of Time and what is known today as Assassin's Creed. It went through a few iterations. One saw the titular prince becoming an assassin, while another saw the player taking on the role of the prince's assassin bodyguard. There was even a co-op version of the game running at one point, internal footage of which had been leaked online. The prince had become an assassin and was in the Levant, level design director Philippe Bergeron says, so the setting was very Assassin's Creed-like, but we didn't know that at the time. Players also had a co-op partner, so it was also like a co-op game. We had sessions of free-running and parkouring through the streets and a Middle Eastern market. While this was a very promising concept, the team felt that it didn't entirely gel with the Prince of Persia game they had just finished working on. The more we looked at it, the more it became clear that the whole Prince story didn't make sense anymore, Bergeron explains. This was the start of Prince of Persia Assassins transitioning into something new, but there were a few additional factors that helped Ubisoft make the change. First, launching a game early in the life cycle of the new consoles meant that releasing a new brand made a lot of sense. Also, on a personal level, creating a new intellectual property, IP, would be a dream come true for Raymond. I spent a lot of time thinking about what the best conditions were for creating a new IP. One thing I noticed was that all the biggest IPs were usually launched when a new console came out, and then the game's sequels would extend that console's life. This was usually the pattern of success. When people buy a new console, they are buying the dream of playing games that they have never been able to play before, and which weren't possible on previous consoles. It's actually really appealing to create a new brand from scratch, to be able to take advantage of a new console, and to not be tied to what the brand used to be or to the old console's tech. It's really liberating. That was the approach I really wanted to take with the team. I also thought that from a business perspective, it made a lot of sense. Second, while Ubisoft owned the Prince of Persia catalog, it didn't actually own the Prince of Persia IP. That still belonged to its original creator, Jordan Mechner. Ubisoft Montreal at that time had mostly been making Tom Clancy titles, Raymond says. They didn't really have their own IP. This was a great opportunity to add value to Ubisoft, while also giving the players something worthwhile. If players were going out and spending $500 on a new console, they would want something that was unique to that console, and which wouldn't have been possible before. I really thought the business logic was there. I talked to Giannis about it. I wanted to create a brand that, if possible, could expand and be transmedia. Our big dream at the time was making 3 games in total, and being able to make sequels that weren't mere afterthoughts. We would spend time on the first game really thinking about how the sequels would fit in, and designing the brand to have an opening for those sequels. Raymond had discussed with Giannis Malat the possibility of Prince of Persia Assassins becoming its own brand, and all it took was a conversation at the video game trade show, Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3, back in 2005. I had made all these spreadsheets and produced an executive presentation to convince people we should create our own IP, Raymond says. At E3, Giannis told me to go talk to Laurent Detoc, who ran business for North America, and give him the pitch. Of course, I didn't have all my spreadsheets or my nice PowerPoint, but I just went over, introduced myself, and gave him the pitch about why I thought it should be a new IP. Straight away he said, "Yes, I agree, let's do it." That was a pretty cool experience. Work continued on Assassin's Creed in earnest with a few core pillars at its center. These were largely the same as those of Prince of Persia Assassins, which aimed to make the most of the power of the upcoming PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. First, this was going to be an open world game. Second, players would be able to climb anywhere. Third, there was going to be a focus on crowds within these worlds, which could be used as part of the game's stealth mechanics. CPU and GPU, Central Processing Unit and Graphics Processing Unit, were things that were highly limiting in previous consoles, says Sebastian Puel, brand manager on Assassin's Creed at the time. Those limitations just disappeared. That was the first generation of consoles that truly allowed us to recreate worlds as we know them. We could make cities, streets, and crowds as realistic and believable as possible. That would have been totally impossible on the previous generation consoles. Creating an open world title, in contrast to Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time's more linear structure, brought with it some significant changes in how levels were constructed. Designers weren't creating a specific route for the player to navigate, but rather were tasked with giving the player an entire world to explore. It was the first time internally that we made an open world game, Bergeron says. There were open world games on the market at the time, like Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City. While we had points of reference that we could look to, we didn't know what that meant for Ubisoft. A lot of it was trying to identify what the paradigms for design were. As a result, the crew had to come up with some design parameters that allowed them to combine their desire to make levels that ideally push players toward a given objective, while also allowing users to ultimately do, well, whatever they wanted. The player can come in from any given direction, Bergeron says, so we have to make sure that the player's freedom always remained, despite how they played. Ideally, developers don't guide the player. We don't take control away from them and tell them this is an experience they're going to live. We may suggest an objective, an encounter or situation, but then we must accept that the player is going to do it their own way and embrace that. But what we were afraid of was lowering the game's quality or not having the ability to properly set the stage with certain misses on sense like we had done in our previous games. We adapted as we went on. We decided that instead of having one singular path, we'll design 3 or 4 different paths to any given quest. They weren't paths that the player is forced to travel along either. They're the paths that we imply that the player should go down. If they decide to go down them, that's awesome. But if they don't, we still have to support them. That became one of our rules. Adding to the complexity of designing open worlds was the fact that, unlike other open world games at the time, such as the blockbuster Grand Theft Auto, Assassin's Creed setting was truly a 3-dimensional space that players could navigate. Players weren't just confined to the ground. Ubisoft's game was heavily focused on vertically, and users could scale buildings to reach their goals. It was focused on verticality. As a result, the team came up with a system of what it called opportunities within the world. In other words, the developers created levels so that the player was given the option to do something different on a regular basis. In Prince of Persia, there was only one path for a player to follow, only one climbing path to reach something. This design wouldn't work for Assassin's Creed, which was heavily parkour and climbing based. The team had to ensure that they always provided several action paths for players to use to reach objectives. To do this, the designers needed to think of the game as a matrix of opportunities. Bergeron explains, we started formulating this philosophy where you could look at any given map or any given location through a wider frame format, which was a network of connectivity. Therefore, it was almost like a lattice or a matrix around a space where at any given 10 meters, you needed to make sure that there was an opportunity to progress another 10 meters. But then you turn on and off some of these edges, if you will, in the matrix that determines whether the player can go that way or not. That became a type of 3D maze, which led to the same objective in the end. But players still had to analyze what that matrix looked like, and then determine where the path was. It was a way for us to examine any given map and analyze whether we had enough paths, if we had created enough blockers, and whether this whole space was an interesting navigation puzzle. This approach to design means that the player is given the illusion of choice while never being blocked off and told they can't go somewhere. They can go down whichever path they want. They won't be stopped. Ultimately, however, they will end up where the developers wanted them to be all along. We didn't have dead ends in the way, Bergeron says. The player doesn't end up in a situation where they can't go anywhere. There's always an option. There's never a segment that ends in a wall. There's always a way to branch off and eventually reach the same endpoint. We didn't end up with just 2 or 3 paths that lead to the goal. Instead, there's an array of paths throughout the whole level. Puel became producer on Assassin's Creed II before being appointed executive producer on the Assassin's Creed franchise until 2014. And here's Masyaf, or not Masyaf, but the city in one of the cities in AC1. Navigating through these worlds was going to be done with an evolution of Prince of Persia's signature acrobatic platforming style, making use of parkour or free running. Well, this was a cool and smooth way for the player to make their way around these cities. Establishing this as a reality was a real technical achievement for the development team. This required gameplay programmers and animation animators to work really closely together, Claude Langlis, the technical director, explains. At the time, we were still mostly animating by hand. I think we did a bit of motion capture, but we used what's called inverse kinematics tech. This allowed us to place the limbs in a more precise manner, even if we didn't have the precise movement that had been animated. We built a lot of systems to simplify the way to determine how and where to place limbs, whether it was legs or hands. We tried a few different ways of building systems, overlays or tools, on top of animation to make it easier to make these transitions. Because this team was so motivated and caring, they managed to tweak all the different things and to build all the systems below. The group pushed systems from Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, such as the method by which the game indicated which surfaces players could climb on. We had built a very simple tech for Sands of Time called the guidance system, Langlis says. This system flagged edges that the player could climb. We pushed that to a full 3D environment for Assassin's Creed so that the player would know what they could climb on. The rules that governed this on a gameplay level were simple. For example, if something stuck out more than a bit from a wall, then it could be used to scale the surface. Whatever stuck out from the geometry, you were able to grab onto, Langlis says. It wasn't something that was placed by hand or by the developers. It was a system following a set of rules. The player learned that if something was sticking out enough, and if it's not too shallow, then they would be able to grab onto it. That was an automated system, but the rules that came out of it became a foundation of our Assassin's Creed technical design guidelines. It was our job to make sure that the visuals matched the functional side of things. If you saw something that stuck out, you would be able to grab onto it. If there was something that looked like the player should be able to grab onto it, but they couldn't, we treated that as a bug. The environment had to be legible. You had to understand what you could grab onto. Brand director Florence Picard adds, the idea with Assassin's Creed was to give players a lot more freedom than Prince of Persia. I remember the team and everyone at the company being super excited by the fact that players could climb anywhere on the building. Everything that stood out by more than 2 inches from the main building was something players could try to hook onto and climb. That was a big breakthrough for the game, and it opened up a lot of possibilities. At the time, that wasn't something that had been done before in video games. Climbing wasn't the only animation masterstroke. Mechanics like the character's feet landing perfectly on a surface took a lot of work. Even today, that's something that a lot of games fail to manage. One of the points in production when I knew we were onto something was when a programmer showed us the character running on beams, Puel remembers. We had these perfect inverse kinematics, which provided a perfect contact between the feet of the character and the beams. The character was able to run on the roofs and so on. We had some really exceptional animators and programmers who were able to do things that we had never seen before. Navigating this world was also intended to be as easy as possible. Creative lead Patrice Desilets was set on introducing what he dubbed full emotional body control, a system he predicted would make piloting characters in video games easier for those who weren't super experienced gamers. He had this idea that someday controls were going to need to be standardized, Raymond explains. You'd be able to pick up and play any game and not have to learn the controls, which was a valid and worthwhile objective. He thought the controls should be the same for all games and should be based on a puppeteering logic. Anyone who hadn't played a video game for ages would be able to pick up a controller and instantly understand that, for instance, the head is the top button, The left hand is the left button, the right hand is the right button, and the bottom button relates to the feet. He argued that we should map out the controls based on that kind of logic, that it should be fully intuitive. Us and them. The team worked hard to flesh out the game's universe as a 2-day off-site meeting in Montreal. Part of this was figuring out who the series' major players were and what the big mysteries of the world were going to be. I spent a lot of time reading tons of books about secret societies like Illuminati and the Rosicrucians, Raymond says. Patrice was also interested in that. Having there be a central mystery as part of the IP was something that was really important to me. We talked about a whole bunch of different things. What could be at the core of the mystery, or this type of revisionist history that we wanted to do. Having the Templars as protagonists made sense, since the first game was set during the Third Crusade, which was obviously a holy crusade. That could be where our story started out, with them and the Assassins. This wasn't just going to be a conflict between these two different organizations either. The dispute between the Templars and Assassins was much more ideological in nature. The actual saying of the Assassins in some of the books that we read during our research is, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," Raymond explains. When we talk about the Assassin's Creed, that's what we mean. When we talked about the setting, about the Assassins versus the Templars, we knew that the Creed was at the root of the meaning we were trying to build around. It made sense to put the Templars in opposition to them, and to make the struggle about control. This also helped the team come up with a rubric by which they could decide settings for future games. On the first Assassin's Creed, we spent almost the whole first year talking about the brand's architecture, or framework, Raymond says. What we decided was we would pick a pivotal moment in history where we could explain the changes in our revisionist history by saying that they were due to the actions of either the Assassins or Templars. That was the most important thing. We considered obvious time periods. Where would it make sense for the Assassins to be, and what were the pivotal moments? We brainstormed, and to this day there's still a list of potential time periods and locations, almost like a franchise roadmap. The notion of control versus free will also played into the story of Assassin's Creed, which saw the game's protagonist, Altair ibn Lahad, hunting down several artifacts called the Pieces of Eden. These were capable of powerful illusions that could be used as a form of control, and which were the fruit of narrative director Philippe Morin's mind. The existence of such seemingly advanced technology during the Third Crusade was definitely a hook that would keep people coming back for more. It's important to have those types of roots and distant mountains established when you're first working on a franchise, Raymond explains. That way you can maintain consistency all along. It's not something you figure out later. That's really what has helped Assassin's Creed have the longevity that it's enjoyed. We did a lot of the work for the franchise during the first game's development. There was enough material there to continue to evolve what turned out to be many more games beyond our initial plans. Location, location, location. Assassin's Creed features 3 cities that the player can explore: Jerusalem, Acre, and Damascus. Not only do each of these places have a distinct feel, but they all feature a number of different districts within them. It was almost like planning a city, art director Raphael Lacoste says. You had the poor district, which would look very interesting, perhaps more organic or human. The more official districts would have official religious buildings with big gardens and more organized streets. We were working with a top-down view, looking at the layouts. Rather than making a linear path, it was more about making an entire blueprint of a city and making sure that we kept the player curious about the various areas in the city. The big landmarks could be seen from a distance, but we also needed smaller landmarks, like a fountain, a door, etc. All of this was to make sure that we had ways of guiding the player in the city, while still keeping the player curious about discovering all these different districts. It was a really cool challenge. As mentioned earlier, creating full 3D worlds for players to explore was a unique challenge, though one that the team relished. It was super interesting for the team to bring these different cities to life, with various approaches and tones, Lacoste explains. Creating a 360-degree environment, one that players can explore in every single direction, wasn't just the biggest challenge of my career, but for the artists and level designers as well. We had to give specific attention to details from afar, such as having interesting compositions and city skylines. At the same time, players could climb these buildings and have their noses right up against specific textures. Even for the new consoles, that was one of our biggest challenges. We had one of the most highly detailed open world games. Our intention for the franchise was to keep this high level of detail for a long time, all while also making an open world game and granting players the freedom to navigate throughout the environment. Each city was portrayed as existing during a static time of the day, but they were all given a specific kind of mood, thanks to the colors that the Montreal team used to create them. We had very bold colors for all the cities Lacoste remembers. Acre was more of a cyan blue and white color with other highlights. Jerusalem was more mystical with these green and gold values, which were very interesting and spiritual. Meanwhile, Damascus had orange, gold, and very warm colors. This was also connected to the music and to the style. Every single city had a very exclusive, specific tone. Like with all future Assassin's Creed games, the team worked hard to accurately recreate the title's time period. Replicating the Third Crusade turned out to be pretty challenging. Over time, we doubled down on the historical research, Bergeron says. Back then, we still wanted to make it a really medieval game. The Third Crusade was recorded as far as the events go, but in terms of architecture and the people, it wasn't as well known. Obviously, we had a lot of liberty. I remember at one point trying to find city layouts of the time. That involved a lot of going through history and archaeological books. I forget exactly which one we ended up using, but we found this magnificent book. It was huge, like 3 feet by 2 feet. It was a giant manuscript that had the full medieval layout of a whole bunch of cities. That's where we got the plans for Acre, for Damascus, and for Jerusalem. This served as a starting point for the team to show them what these cities look like from a top-down perspective, allowing the developers to see where important buildings were, and so on. From there, Ubisoft tried to figure out which historical figures were alive at the time, and, perhaps more importantly, which of them died near the game's historical setting of 1191. To choose our targets, we researched who the Grand Master, Templars of that period were within Acre, Jerusalem, and Damascus. We chose the ones who seemed to fit into our timeline. We often didn't know exactly who each person was because there was so little information available. We added character to them and made them into believable video game bad guys. Recreating history within Assassin's Creed is something that Ubisoft would give increased focus to as time went on, but even at the start, some in the academic community were blown away by what the Montreal studio had accomplished. There were concerns about some of the historical elements during the Crusades within the game. Because of this, I contacted Dr. Paul Cobb, who worked at the University of Notre Dame at the time. The senior director of PR for Ubisoft, Michael Beadle, explains. We reached out to him, and he ended up working directly with the development team. He reviewed the entire game script as well as art and gameplay footage to make sure that it was both historically accurate as well as culturally appropriate while keeping sensitivities in mind. He was very impressed. He's told us he'd never seen anything this detailed in his lifetime about this era of history. Being able to recreate entire cities in the Middle East during this time period blew him away. The aim wasn't just to build these huge worlds, complete with recreations of medieval cities. The Assassin's Creed team wanted to fill them too. This was largely done by the team asking themselves what they would do with all the extra processing power that the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 were said to have. One idea that stuck out was large crowds of people, far greater than anything seen before in the previous generation of consoles. We were going to be able to do a lot more with artificial intelligence, including crowds, Raymond says. We had some really ambitious tech people on the team. We told one of them, James Therian, that we wanted to have crowds of 50 people. On previous gens, if you had more than created characters, everything broke down. But James was like, no, we'll have crowds of 200 people. It's nice to have tech people who aren't saying no, but instead are really ambitious. We had a really determined tech team. We were going to have huge crowds. Being able to simulate large numbers of NPCs, non-playable characters, in a world was a great way to make an area feel alive and populated, but it also would come to serve a useful gameplay function, social stealth. Patrice had always been a big fan of the Metal Gear Solid series, Raymond explains. The idea of stealth was something that he'd always liked as a gamer, so when we talked about crowds, he wanted to look at how we could reinvent stealth now that we had this new tech available. Picard adds, when I first saw the game, what really stood out was the use of the crowd as a gameplay ingredient, the social stealth. the fact that you could be in a crowd and use it as cover meant you could have a very intricate interaction between the main character and the crowd. One of the references that was used at the time was that an American football player or rugby player touching people on their shoulders to pass through the throng, and then using his parkour skills to get out of the crowd. Someone who could use a crowd to be stealthy was high on the list of qualities that the team envisioned for the protagonist of Assassin's Creed. The Montreal team was set on the hero being an assassin, too, which fit with someone acrobatic and adept at sneaking. The first thing is that this character should be able to hide in a crowd, Sebastian Puel, executive producer of the Assassin's Creed brand between 2009 and 2014, explains. At the same time, you want them to be a real hero. How is this character going to stand out while also being able to believably blend into a crowd? That was one thing that was difficult to imagine. That's why we came up with this concept of the hood that the character wore when they were in a crowd, so they didn't look out of place within the game. Concept artists did around 60 drawings to show different takes of what their protagonist could look like, with the team eventually landing on a sketch of a man in a white monk cloak with a red sash around his waist. This sketch was drawn by Ubisoft Montreal's current art director, Kai Nguyen. They nailed this character pretty late in the production, maybe 2005, Lacoste says. They had this sense of wanting to keep this white, pure color for the outfit, making a connection with the monk. Here's someone who is answering his call to duty, but he's also a killer. So there's this interesting contrast between the austerity of the design and this almost killing machine power he can have in Assassins. From there, the team had to figure out what kind of face Altair would have. This started with character art lead Patrick Gagne coming up with a bunch of different looks for the protagonist, but these didn't quite hit the mark. So the team decided to speak to some modeling and acting agencies in the Montreal area. At this time, games weren't really using likenesses so much, Raymond explains, so we were given the okay from legal. This was the first time Ubisoft had done this. We got the approval from legal, we did the casting, we had a model walk in, and we were like, okay, that's the face we want to use. It was the first game that did a scan based on someone. We actually ended up doing scans of a lot of the other people who showed up to use for crowds and other characters in the game. That casting ended up being really useful. It's obviously rather commonplace now, but it was the first time Ubisoft had done that. The final part of the process of creating the character of Altair was figuring out his personality and how he fit into the world of Assassin's Creed. This was also done as part of the same 2-day off-site meeting that the core team organized to determine the game's universe. We spent a full day just on Altair, Raymond remembers. We were asking questions about him, such as how he feels about being an assassin and how he kills. Those really added a lot of the touches. I think that made Altair unique and original. Patrice said that Altair kills lovingly, and we thought that was a very original way to think about an assassin. What does it mean to kill lovingly? This inspired us to have those trademark moments after he had killed someone, where he would lay the body down. He's doing it with respect. We also asked what kind of animal Altair would be and landed on the eagle. That's why there's a peak in his hood, and why he's always perched up on high buildings and things like that. Puel adds, Altair was defined as a bird of prey. He's not a mass killer. He's someone who is driven by political conflicts. He is at the top of the building, at the top of the city, looking down at his prey. He's only going after one specific target. We really felt he was a bird of prey. As a result, there are a lot of key poses that we defined so they could look like an eagle. The name Altair, of course, comes from one of the Arabic words for eagle, but it also had another meaning. Altair is also the name of a star in the Aquila constellation, Puel explains. That name really showed what the character was. He was an eagle, a bird of prey. He was in the sky, on the roofs. He would look at his prey and hit them when he decided. Though he has many weapons at his disposal, Altair is best known for using the hidden blade, a retractable knife that sits on the inside of his wrist. This is the reason why assassins don't have their ring finger. This weapon was chosen for fairly obvious reasons. He had to be able to hide it under his cloak, Raymond says. Altair had to be able to blend into the crowd. While the vision of Assassin's Creed is very much in line with that of the original mandate for a next-generation Prince of Persia game, with crowds and parkour, one feature that was originally planned during that project is missing: cooperative gameplay. Prince of Persia Assassins at one stage featured a co-op mode, which was dropped due to the huge demand it would have placed on the team, both technically and from a design perspective. We were pushing our tech in so many different areas that building Assassin's Creed with a multiplayer or co-op setting would have been too much, Langlis remembers. We had to put that aside to focus on everything else. It was a bridge too far technically, but also in terms of design. Doing everything in a co-op setting, whether the players are there or not, added a layer of complexity to the proceedings. We had to focus and properly realize this open world with its dynamic loading, crowds, and parkour. Just that on its own was enough. Initially, Deluxe wanted Assassin's Creed to have no UI, user interface, or menus. That meant no maps or any kind of assistance. Instead, players would have to figure out how to find and complete an objective, just like the character was going to have to. Eventually, this was dropped because playtesting showed that it made Assassin's Creed too difficult for a lot of people. As a result, the team introduced UI elements and a map into the game, but the map wasn't going to be visible in its entirety from the start. We had already built these cities with lots of amazing high buildings and loads of verticality, Raymond remembers. Patrice said, the assassin will climb up to the top of these high buildings like an eagle, and that's how players are going to defog the map. We were going to put maps in the game, but there was still an element of exploration. Reaching high points allowed Altair to sync up with the world and unlock various areas of the cities he was exploring. This kind of mechanic has become rather common in the open world genre, in games from both Ubisoft and other companies. But what sets this mechanic apart in Assassin's Creed is what comes next, the leap of faith. After unlocking a new part of the world, the character leaps from the top of this high point all the way back down to the street level. This was inspired by the tales of explorer Marco Polo. There's a book that both Patrice and I had read called The Adventures of Marco Polo, where he comes across the original assassins, Raymond says. He describes how amazing they are and how they will do anything their master says. Their master gives a display to Marco Polo where he lines a bunch of them up and orders them to jump to their deaths, and they just do it. Polo sees that this is a whole other level of soldier. So Patrice said that in this version of the story, the assassins aren't really leaping to their deaths. It was all a mind game, and it ties into the whole nothing is true, everything is permitted. It was just a display for Marco Polo, and they were actually jumping down to someplace safe, but it looked like they were willing to jump to their deaths. In fact, there is a scene in the original Assassin's Creed that circles back to this at Masyaf. A group of assassins all jumped down on the orders of their leader, Al-Molim, in order to intimidate the Templars, but the team wanted to do more with the idea of the leap of faith. We already had that concept in mind, and it was something we wanted to talk about, Raymond says. So we said, why don't we bring that leap of faith concept into how you get down from these high points that you've climbed up. We had some bales of hay that he would fall into. We had a good laugh about that. It was ridiculous. It was funny, but still somewhat effective. Including more UI elements in Assassin's Creed also resulted in eagle vision. This is an ability that allows certain individuals to locate hidden passageways, to distinguish illusion from truth, and to locate and track targets through a color-coded view of the world. Eagle vision was something that came a little later, Raymond says. It wasn't initially planned. However, when we needed to put in more UI to help the player, Patrice came up with the concept. The cutting edge. In addition to making a new property for Ubisoft, the team at Montreal was also creating a brand new game engine. The studio had previously used the Jade engine to create both Beyond Good and Evil. The tech was even named after the title's protagonist and Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time. But this engine wasn't going to be able to hack it with the new consoles, which represented a colossal increase in computational power. The new consoles needed a game engine that could handle this higher amount of power. Ubisoft Montreal had started to build the Scimitar. Scimitar was renamed Anvil in 2009. Engine, alongside the next generation Prince of Persia game that would become Assassin's Creed back in 2004. At that point, the Jade engine had run its course, Bergeron explains. The way it was structured was mainly intended for corridor games. You couldn't do an open world game with the Jade engine. We knew from the outset that we needed to make an open world. We also wanted to have crowds as a gameplay element, which meant having a lot of NPCs on screen. Both of those things led to us making our own engine. Creating a game engine is an intensely complicated process, even for those who had the experience of doing so. No one on the Assassin's Creed team had made this kind of tech before, which meant that it took a long time to build. It was a real challenge, Langlis says. Building a game itself is hard work, but building a game while the engine itself is evolving over time is a monumental task. Though building a new engine was a huge ask for the crew, it was also entirely necessary. Simply put, Assassin's Creed couldn't have been built on any of the existing engines of the time. None of the tech that we had at the time could do what we were trying to do with Assassin's Creed, Langlis insists. Growing that tech, evolving the engine to be able to achieve the vision, was the only way for us to build Assassin's Creed. We managed to do it in a way that could serve this new game but also be reused for other Ubisoft games afterward. For the first 2 years of Assassin's Creed development, the team making it did not have access to the tech that would power the game. Only in 2006 could developers actually use Scimitar to make content for the title. Until that point, they had to find other means to work on Assassin's Creed. As designers, we were doing prototypes on the Jade engine, Bergeron says. I did some prototypes in Unreal. A lot of the designing was done on paper. Raymond adds, within a few years, we had created a brand new engine and a brand new IP. The concepts we had were great, but we were pretty stressed because the engine wasn't ready yet. I remember a moment where we had something like 21 level designers, which was a lot for the time, who had no tools to use. They were sitting there and panicking. Half the group was still prototyping in the old engine, and people were coming to see me and saying that they wanted to get their work done, but they didn't have any of the necessary tools. It was super frustrating. All of us really wanted to make this game. There was this list of features to build, and it was just a lot. Everything was very ambitious. When the engine was ready, the team was ready to jump into action. They had several years' worth of ideas and prototypes to be implemented. Thankfully, Scimitar allowed the developers to do a lot of things they couldn't have done before. It allowed us to have way more people working on the same maps at the same time, Bergeron says. From a level designer perspective, in Jade or Unreal at the time, only one designer could work on a map at a given time. With Scimitar, every single item in a world was decompressed, decomposed into individual files, so multiple people could be working in the same space at the same time without having to check in or check out. It made collaboration so much easier. That was one of the engine's biggest strengths at that point, I think. While the next generation consoles were the focus of Assassin's Creed's development, the Ubisoft Montreal crew did explore bringing the experience in a limited form to the PlayStation 2. But due to the huge technical differences between the upcoming machines and Sony's older hardware, this was simply not possible. We tried to deliver part of the promise of Assassin's Creed on the PlayStation 2, Pure remembers, but we gave up after a few months. The dream of having an entire city filled with crowds just couldn't exist on the PS2. The team said it was impossible to deliver even part of the promise on the PS2, so we ended up dropping that from the project. Striking from the shadows. With development now going at full speed, Ubisoft had to think about how to reveal and market Assassin's Creed. The title was first teased at Tokyo Game Show 2005 under the name Project Assassins, before an updated version of this promo video was released with the name Assassin's Creed. The project had actually been shown off publicly before this at the Game Developers Conference, GDC. The team had done a presentation discussing their work on inverse kinematics and cameras in action-adventure games. They had this video talking about all this, with an ambiguous character running around the world, for the GDC audience, Beetle remembers. This was being shown live before we had actually announced it. At the time, I was in cover story talks to reveal the game, which ended up being with Game Informer. I had to let them know what was being shared at GDC, and that it was nothing explicitly tied to any of our projects in development. We just wanted to show off some things our studios have been working on to the industry. Thankfully, no one connected the dots, not least because no one really knew what was being shown. It helped that at the time, social media wasn't as prevalent as it is today. But the game's proper full reveal came in a trailer made for E3 2006. This guaranteed that everyone was talking about Assassin's Creed, whereas previous videos had been cryptic, showing only snippets of gameplay. This pre-rendered trailer laid bare the vision of what Assassin's Creed would be. The video starts with Altair up on a bell tower, scouting out his target. In a split second, he disappears, only to be found walking through the crowd, before striking and eliminating his target. From there, he makes his escape, taking to the rooftops, chased by knights, only to be cornered against a large wooden door. It looks like game over for our hero, until a group of monks emerges from the doors, allowing him to escape unseen. Not only was this trailer an impressive way to show off the game to the public, it also allowed the team in Ubisoft Montreal to co-assess their version of Assassin's Creed. By this point, work on the title had been going on for years. The developers were not short on ideas, but they needed to pare down the project to its key mechanics. I do think the trailer helped us a lot, Raymond admits. We had all of these ideas on paper. Some of them were in prototypes, some of them were in concept art. But that trailer really tied together the vision clearly and made it something high def, in a way that everyone understood even more. It was really important for the team because it showed how all this came together. Langless adds, the first E3 was really where we started seeing the vision. There was a lot of hype, but in the end, we actually managed to build something that was really close to the vision that we had at the very beginning. Eagle-eyed viewers of that trailer will notice a crossbow on the back of our hero Altair. This was in fact something that players were meant to have in their arsenal in the first Assassin's Creed, but this was cut, as the development staff couldn't figure out how to implement it without making the game too easy. Alongside the CGI computer-generated imagery trailer at E3 2006, Ubisoft was showing off Assassin's Creed behind closed doors. After years of working behind the scenes, it was unsurprisingly gratifying for the teams to show off the fruits of their labor. It was a really stable build, Langless says. We spent a lot of long late nights making that in the build-up to E3. We had played the demo lots of times. We knew it back to front. We were just proud to show the results of almost 3 years spent working on it. That was really interesting. It was a very different kind of work than building a game engine, but it was super rewarding to receive feedback. Game Informer cover. Right down here. Assassin's Creed was first revealed on the cover of Game Informer magazine in June 2006. The ambitious vision for this inaugural game was delivered across 10 of the magazine's pages, featuring first-look screenshots, concept art, quotes from the development team, and impressions by Game Informer staff. In the months leading up to the story's publication, 2 of Assassin's Creed's creators, Patrice Deluxe and Jade Redmond, traveled to Game Informer's Minneapolis, Minnesota headquarters to pitch the concept of the game for cover consideration. They spent 3 hours discussing its many inspiration points and even talked about how it could become a franchise that consisted of many chapters. Modern values. Once it had been decided that Prince of Persia Assassins would become its own brand, Raymond wanted to ensure that this wasn't just a one-off title, but that it was going to be a franchise. There really had to be a strategy or a story device that future teams could use to expand the brand without the brand going all over the place. You need that consistency, Raymond explains. The other thing that we were talking about a lot was that our first game took place in the Third Crusade, which is interesting and very original in terms of a setup for the game. There weren't many games taking place in that part of the world or during that historic moment, but there were definitely concerns of whether we could make more than one game in that time period. How appealing was that going to be to the mass market? How much are people in general going to be excited about the Third Crusade as a setting? I'd asked Patrice to think about how we could extend the brand, how we could give new teams sandboxes to play in. Not only future game teams, but also book or comics authors and other transmedia projects. How do we make the Third Crusade more relevant? The group started to brainstorm different ideas of how they could create the world of Assassin's Creed while giving future developers the freedom to jump into different time periods, and in a way they were somewhat inspired by the Sands of Time. If you think about the Sands of Time, there was a narrative framework there for death, Raymond says. The prince is narrating the story. If the player dies, he will say something like, "Oh no, that's not how it happened." The first thing Patrice proposed was similar. It would have been someone who has amnesia and is struggling to remember what happened. We thought it was interesting, and it definitely gave some flexibility, but would still be tied to that one person's lifespan. From there, the suggestions became even more outlandish. Ultimately, the recommendations did edge closer to the solution that was eventually landed on for Assassin's Creed. The team kept on saying time travel, Raymond remembers. I said no because time travel is cheesy. I felt that we needed to ground it. We're making a realistic game. It's a historical game. We wanted to make it mature. We needed to come up with our own original thing. So I did some research on the internet, and I found this fringe science paper about genetic memory, which I sent to Corey May, the lead writer for Assassin's Creed. He thought it was awesome. May and Deluxe discussed this even further. The duo came up with the Animus, a machine that could read people's genetic memories to allow them to relive the lives of their long-dead ancestors. The Animus was there to create this connection with the 21st century's players, explains Jean Guesden, the production coordinator on the first Assassin's Creed game. Guesden went on to become the creative director for several of the franchise's games. Players would have a link with the global universe of the franchise. That's why there is the present-day layer to Assassin's Creed. The Animus was about making sure we had room for future games, and to ensure that we weren't cornered into a specific time period. Going into the Animus in-game was Desmond, a bartender who was kidnapped by Abstergo Industries and forced to relive the memories of Altair, his ancestor. Though Desmond was a key part of the narrative, the decision was made to not develop him very much in the first Assassin's Creed. He's meant to be a blank state, Raymond says. Therefore, we didn't spend a lot of time on him. He's supposed to be you, the player, right? He was supposed to be there to be your passageway into connecting with the past. The character's name was chosen after two of Raymond's best friends named their son Desmond, but that didn't stop some interesting speculation in the media about how this decision was made. It was funny, we were doing interviews and people were asking if we had called him Desmond because it's like Deluxe and Raymond stuck together. To make Desmond, Raymond laughs. We hadn't even realized it, but we thought that was hilarious. I just thought that it was a super cool name. While this did allow Assassin's Creed to become a franchise rather than a single game, some people on Ubisoft's marketing team weren't sure about the modern-day framing of the title. I remember going to a focus test in California where we pitched Assassin's Creed. We told the participants that they'd be playing as an assassin in the Third Crusade, in Acre, Jerusalem, and so on. We spent probably an hour and an hour and a half explaining, and then showing them bits of gameplay imagery. And then we said, by the way, you're actually playing through the genetic memory of someone in current times. What we heard from the participants was that it was hard to understand. As a result, when it came to marketing the game, the focus was put squarely on the historical elements of Assassin's Creed, but there were some subtle hints that there was more to this Third Crusade romp than met the eye. It was an early Middle Ages game, of which there were many at the time, Picard explains, but Assassin's Creed was totally different. The tech was very different, and the imagery needed to be super slick. We wanted it to feel very modern, so we didn't go at all in the tropes of a medieval game. Just by looking at the game cover, you can't really see anything about the environment. It's just a crowd of blue and white people. When it came to the typeface we used for the logo, we could have gone totally medieval with stone textures, but we wanted to stay away from that. Everyone on the development team wanted to have something truly modern. All the sci-fi elements in the lore of the brand were really important to them. It wasn't just a historical recreation. Everything was lived through the Animus, and there was mediocrity in that. There was modernity in that. So that was also a bit different from what was out there at the time. The trailers also alluded to the game having some sci-fi features, as well as having Altair causing chaos in the Third Crusade. There were some subtle indications that the medieval setting wasn't all that it seemed. At the very end of the E3 demo, you had glitches, as well as the audio of Lucy, voiced by Kristen Bell, talking to you, Picard explains. Everybody knew that it wasn't just a game set in the Crusade. They knew that there was something more to it, but we didn't want to say too much. In the end, we wanted to keep it as a surprise. People were also intrigued by the way the marketing campaign played out. For a long time, too, the project was simply known as Assassins. This was the name the development team originally wanted to go with, but marketing felt that the game needed a little extra something to make it sound unique. They kicked off a whole bunch of research about what the name could be, Raymond remembers. I don't know who they worked with, but they came up with this long list which included Assassin's Creed. I think the inspiration for that came from the saying, nothing is true, everything is permitted, which we called the Assassin's Creed. In the end, that was the one we ended up picking. The first civilization. Since the very beginning of the Assassin's Creed franchise, the notion of a highly advanced civilization that preceded our own was a core part of the series. In fact, this group that produced fantastical artifacts, such as the Apple of Eden, was a central element of the overarching mystery. Though they are in some ways fundamental to the franchise, the team initially didn't have an idea as to what this civilization would ultimately be. At first, our plan was that we would end with a third game, and that would be when the Mayan calendar predicted that the end of the world was coming, Raymond explains. At that point, we had an idea that the game would also be tied to the Mayans somehow, but beyond that, we didn't know what it was going to be. Of course, the Assassin's Creed franchise continued beyond the original plans to become a regular series. As the series unfolded, the idea of this prior civilization grew, whereas before they likely would have retained a degree of mystery. As the franchise progressed, more and more was discovered about them. They were known by many names, including those who came before, the precursors, and the first civilization. The Templars classify them as Homo sapiens divinis. To a certain degree, the teams behind every single game use this enigmatic group in different ways, largely to help tell the story they wanted to tell. But eventually narrative director Darby McDavid decided to unify the lore to make it more consistent. In Revelations, we invented these things called memory seals that relive the memories of Altair, he laughs. We invented that strictly for the purpose of doing what we wanted, telling the story we wanted to tell. After Revelations, I started thinking and talking with other writers about how we should define the first Civ. If everyone's just going to use them in their own weird way, we're going to end up with a very disjointed history. 10 years from now, people will have no idea who they are. Around the end of Black Flag and moving into Origins, I started working with other writers on a big Bible about what their history was. By the time the series reached Assassin's Creed 3 and Black Flag, a lot of the mystery surrounding the first civilization had disappeared. This was the time to go all in and define them as a culture and give them a history. With Origins, this group became the Isu. Isu comes from an Egyptian word that means ancient one, McDavid explains. That made sense to me. That word stuck around, and it made sense that the Egyptians would use a variant of it. Over time, the team has expanded upon the lore of the Isu, in particular in the most recent trilogy of games, though McDavid's efforts to unify the Isu mythology were hampered by him leaving Origins. He returned for Valhalla. There, he once again tried to bring all these different strands together. Over the course of these games, the idea that there were separate groups of Isu emerged. In the Assassin's Creed universe, these groups of Isu were what inspired the pantheons of gods that humans worshipped around the world. Valhalla actually helped to clarify some things, like that there were different pantheons of these gods, McDavid explains. If they were a global culture, it makes sense that there would have been Isu all over the world, not just in the Mediterranean. So it also makes sense that more than just stories about these three, Isu, Jupiter, Minerva, and Tiana, had been carried forward to the present day. First civilization artifacts. From the start, artifacts like the Apple of Eden, relics from the Isu, appeared in the franchise. Though the lore and backstory for the first civilization weren't thought about a great deal at the start of the Assassin's Creed series, the team still had design principles when it came to creating this group's artifacts. I remember Patrice talking a lot about Arthur C. Clarke's third law, Guisden explains. That's the idea that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So the Apple of Eden and all of these relics were meant to be actual things. We always said this is technology, not magic. The equivalent is someone in the future finding one of our cell phones. They will look at that the same way we look at first Civ tech. It all had a use. The Apple of Eden was to control the mind. The staff was about power. The shroud was for healing. We had crystal skulls that were used for communication. As a result of the sheer power that these relics represent, Guisden admits it has been tempting to have the player use them more within the games. These elements are on the verge of being magic or a kind of superpower, so it's tempting for the teams to try to use them to create fresh gameplay, he says. In Brotherhood, Ezio uses the Apple of Eden to fight a load of soldiers and freeze their minds. That's always a temptation that we have to fight against. However, when you have several teams working in parallel trying to differentiate themselves from other games in development, having this tech is a kind of a curse. A lot of people want to create something that's good for gameplay, so they simply create a first Civ ingredient. Growing ambition. When the game was shown off at E3 2006, it had only been in full production for a relatively short period of time. Only within the previous 12 months had the team started to grow in size and finally been able to use the Scimitar engine. The initial group of less than 20 people prototyping and trying to flesh out this new IP had begun as the cool neighbors on the production floor next to the developers trying to finish Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. We knew they still had a way to go, but you could tell that something was happening next door, Picard, who was still part of the Prince of Persia marketing team at that point, remembers. They seemed to be having a lot of fun. You could hear them clapping when they had found a good idea or something. There was a lot of energy coming from that team at the time. As work ramped up, the crew grew to around 150 people. That's not an especially large number of developers by today's standards, but at the time it was absolutely huge. I remember meeting Jay to discuss Assassin's Creed, Beetle says. She was so excited, her eyes just lit up. I looked around the workplace and asked out of curiosity how big of a team she was working with. She told me it was the entire floor. That blew my mind. It was also super secret. They had a bit more security. At that point I was thinking that this game was going to be a huge deal. This was a feeling both inside and out. Through trying to fill all the ambition and the myriad concepts that the crew wanted to include in Assassin's Creed into the project, there was definitely a sense that this game was going to be the next big thing. When I joined the project, I really had this feeling that the team was building something that was clearly bigger than itself, says Guazdun, who joined the project in the fall of 2006. There was this feeling that we were making this beast that was just waiting in the shadows to be revealed to the world. I didn't know exactly what it would be, but there was this traction, this hype. Like I said, there was this sense of power. We were really making something special. We had absolutely no idea what it would become, but we, as a team, were all in the same boat with this feeling of creating something singular. At times, it seemed as though the team's ambitions were too big, that they might have bitten off more than they could chew. During development, studios tend to have milestones, moments when they have to show their publisher how they are progressing. That's all well and good when you are working with established tech and have everything you need to get the job done, but that wasn't the case with Assassin's Creed. The Montreal team was very much racing along on a train while still laying the track. For one milestone, the artificial intelligence, AI, was barely working, so the level designers weren't able to build anything because the tools they needed were unavailable. It was all very stressful stuff, but that didn't stop the team from having a good time. We would always plan these end-of-milestone celebrations, Raymond explains. We planned one even knowing this particular milestone was complete crap and that we hadn't hit any of the stuff that we needed to. So Claude Langlis and I went out and we bought a ton of really smelly cheese and wine. After our team meeting where we looked at the results, we all had a huge laugh about the state of the game. We were working really hard, but we enjoyed a good laugh about where things were, and we had this little party at the end. One of my favorite memories was Jean-Francois Duff working on the coding for the crowd AI. He should have been the most frustrated out of all of us because getting a crowd to behave naturally is such a hard problem to solve. At one point, he decided to imitate the AI. He was running around and walking into a wall only to fall down. We all just cracked up. To this day, I think there was something really magical, not just about what we were able to accomplish, but also the experience of working together. It's the fact that even when things were not great, we went to get smelly cheese and we laughed about it and stayed together as a team. That's really the best part of the experience. As is often the case with game development, removing parts of a release was as much a part of the process as was implementing features. The Assassin's Creed team had spent years prototyping and dreaming of what they would do once they finally had the necessary tools. However, the realities of deadlines and release dates often meant that a group was unable to do everything on their wish list. For example, we had to reduce the number of districts, Guazdun says. The original ambition was to have 9 districts per city. In the end, we ended up with 3. That didn't mean that the cities were reduced in terms of size. It just meant that the variety of the districts was reduced so we could produce the game. There were also plans to have more activities for the player to do within the kingdom, the area between the big cities. But when you play the game, it's actually quite empty. There are some guards and some villages that you can cross through, but there's not much to actually do. This was the type of scope reduction we made. The variety of its city settings weren't the only aspect of Assassin's Creed to see a reduction. The game shipped with 9 missions for players to complete, but this figure was initially set to be far, far greater. It was a little bittersweet before launch, Bergeron remembers. We wanted to make a good game. We knew in our hearts what this game could have been. You reach the end of any production and you know what it could have been, but you have to make compromises for it to come out. On the level design side, we had planned something like 72 missions or quests, but in the end we only shipped 9. You know that you could have done more, you know what you cut in between, but of course the player doesn't know that. That's why I say it's bittersweet. People were very happy with the end product, but we knew we could have done something a bit better and that the game could have been bigger. As launch approached, the team was more than aware of Assassin's Creed shortcomings and worked to try to add in some extra activities to flesh out the experience. It was very stressful, Raymond says. We were working really hard and trying to close down the game. It was super ambitious. It was Ubisoft's first open world game, the first project on this engine, and we had to cut things to get it done. We knew that there were issues with repetition and that we hadn't had the time to make enough different activities, especially in the investigation. At the last minute, we were adding new types of investigations, as well as adding feathers and flags, so that there was more to do in the world. Admittedly, these were not our best work, but we knew we had these issues and we had to finish up the game. We were trying to get out the best version we could. Still, Raymond and company are proud of their work on the first Assassin's Creed. It might not have been the full vision that they had intended for release, but the team still achieved a great deal in a relatively short amount of time. We did some pretty amazing things, Raymond says. Within 4 years, we created an entirely new franchise from scratch. We built a brand new engine for Ubisoft. It was the first open world engine. A lot of people think it would be tons of fun to work on a new IP, but they underestimate how much work it requires. People don't understand that, for example, when you are making a Batman game, you know what Batman looks like, you know what car he drives, what tools he has at his disposal, and so on. In a new IP, you have to ask who the main character is, how they pose, what types of clothes they wear, and why are they doing what they are doing. How do they feel about it? What's the style of the IP? Will it have a crossbow or not? Those are all the things that need to be thought of. They need to be consistent and need to be prototyped, because not every idea is going to work. There's a lot more trial and error and much more risk in a new IP. Reviews for Assassin's Creed were generally positive, though critics pointed out the repetitive elements. Regardless, between its initial 2007 launch and April 2009, Assassin's Creed shipped 8 million copies. After release, Ubisoft said the game had greatly outstripped expectations. And while content might not have been entirely where the team had hoped it would be by launch, the fundamentals and foundations were there, ready for other teams to build upon in the future. This was a blockbuster brand that would not only go far beyond the original 3 games that the Montreal crew had dreamed of, it was going to change Ubisoft forever. Inspired by historical events and characters, this work of fiction was designed, developed, and produced by a multicultural team of various religious faiths and beliefs. Assassin's Creed, a warm welcome. One of the first things you see when you load up Assassin's Creed is a message from the developer. This tells you that the game was created by people with a variety of beliefs and backgrounds from around the world. When he first booted up Assassin's Creed, Michael Beadle was surprised to see this message. He himself had written it, but he was unaware that it had been included in the game. During the PR campaign for Assassin's Creed, I received an email from a journalist who was questioning some of the historical elements and perspectives of the game. I shared that with Jade on the dev team and asked what her thoughts on it were. She had a very strong response and said that it wasn't true. In reply, I drafted a message highlighting that the game was made by people with a variety of beliefs and views and sent it to the journalist. In the end, there was never an article written on the topic. Months went by and Beadle didn't give a second thought to the reply he had sent the reporter. Then he loaded up the game. I remember sitting down, putting the disc for Assassin's Creed in, and firing it up, and this message popped up on the screen. I was like, wait a second, what? The next day I went into the office and messaged Jade about the disclaimer at the beginning of the game. She said, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. The dev team and I loved it so much that we wanted to put it in the start of the game because we thought it represented all of us. The opening screen displayed above was featured in Assassin's Creed Unity. Alright guys, that is Chapter 1 of the history of Assassin's Creed, the making of Assassin's Creed 15th anniversary. Stay tuned, we will dive into Chapter 2, the Ezio trilogy, in a separate video. Thanks for watching.